it's hard to develop when you don't have some kind of base for it to build off of, some kind of base that gives access for people to skills and to a level of social stability that facilitates manufacturing development. So basically, what would I recommend? I would recommend three things very briefly. First of all, we do need to get our basic social institutions right, particularly education, but also a whole lot of other things like healthcare. Secondly, we need to start thinking about more initiatives that, in my mind, target household income as the primary way to develop our economy. Our economy and our social consensus has really been around support to business and support to really having some kind of industrial development. That's our basic type of economic approach. We might need to start thinking about strengthening our social sphere and our societies and our households before we're actually able to see returns from a focus on industry and from a focus on business. That means new programs like, for example, providing childcare centers or providing debt protection to people who are most indebted or most poor. And also then looking, third, at really reworking our social welfare system. And in my mind, we really need to start having a discussion about moving away from a needs-based that's on specific needs like childcare grants or old age grants, and towards more unconditional cash transfers, at least for the very poorest. That involves a very big change to how government works in South Africa. It will involve an entirely different structuring of our budget and how we think about the working of our government. But it is something that could be a powerful mechanism to give money to the types of people we need to, both for social justice and transformation, but also to create a societal base that allows for economic growth and job creation in the long run. So I'll leave it at that, I think.
Thanks very much to Mzu and Chris. And the paper that they write together, I think it's chapter 3 of the audit. There was a quote that I really liked in describing the effects of the transition to democracy. And there's 2 points actually that are made in there that I think are significant for us to think about this moment we're in. The first is that we talk often about the transition, but the term transition is inherently short term. The concept of something being transitional is that it's a short-term solution. So we're in this kind of extended transition 23 years into democracy, and where the assumption of the transition was that it would create the base for some long-term thinking and some long-term solutions once the political foundation was laid, then that there would be long-term solutions in the social and in the economic spheres, and that hasn't taken place. And one of the ways that they describe this dilemma, I suppose, that we're in, is that South Africa's transition resulted in, and I quote, us building a halfway house of democratization that lacked economic foundations. And I think that that's such a lovely way to think about where we are as a country, where that countries and functioning systems are not built, actually, as much as I hate to say this as a political scientist, they're not built on political institutions. They're built on socioeconomic foundations. And that's an area of our lives that has been sorely neglected in the last 23 years.
And the 2 points I'm going to make is that we need to be clear about whether we're talking about changing the rules or breaking the rules. So, and those are the rules of a market economy. So I think certainly business thought that there was a socioeconomic part of the negotiated settlement, in actual fact. And that it wasn't a halfway house. And they said the rules have been put in place, and those are the rules of the market economy. We've opened up, we've liberalized, we've swept away all the apartheid regulations, and we've adopted this market system. And here we are, we're going to put a few gatekeepers in place, like the Competition Commission, and they're going to solve the problem. Having worked there for 6 years, I can say they solve the problem as much as traffic cops create better driving, right? Because they don't. It's a backward-looking thing, and you penalize, and then people try and avoid the rules next time round. And if it doesn't work, then people start breaking the rules. That's where we are now. Saying the rules don't work. Why are we following these rules? They don't work. Wake up, right? A large portion of the population is saying, these rules do not work. So I don't need to follow them. I shouldn't follow them. And so that's one part of the conversation that we need to be having, I think, if we're more frank with ourselves. The second part, I think, is about focusing on wealth rather than income. Because in the liberalization process, about creating markets and opening up to markets, you're inherently advantaged if you have assets and endowments. And those assets and endowments are intergenerational. So I agree 100% with Chris in that sense. But it's worse under a liberalized environment because you're saying go and compete, but compete with what you've got. And we're not going to change what you've got. Remember, when Germany unified, West Germans paid a higher tax to support East Germany. Okay, so even in the UK, the Labour government came in and they had a windfall tax. I believe in Ecuador recently, about 10 years ago, renegotiated all their mineral rights. They changed the rules and said we're still going to have rules going forwards. And obviously, when that change happens, the redistribution leads to people fighting and screaming. But actually, when the rules have got a stronger support behind them, people are more likely to stick with them. We're in denial about this, I think, at the moment. And I particularly think business is in denial about this. There's a bit of, let's go back to the mid-2000s and we'll be okay. And that's not. The seeds of where we are comes from that trajectory, I think. So I think when we look at learning from our experiment, I think we do need to look at those two things. I think in the context of the intergenerational transfers, I don't think the white population are basically willing to acknowledge their advantage yet. I don't think that actually that mind shift has happened. And there's a very interesting discussion in one of the chapters about difficult conversations. And Zu didn't raise it, but it's very interesting talking about difficult conversations that we need to have. A what happened conversation is very important. A feelings conversation, an identity conversation. And I think that's a very important contribution, which I would like to bring up. Just to give an example of that in the context of recent debates about the Bancorp bailout, the Public Protector's report. There's an agreement that the Bancorp bailout was incorrect, was probably against the law at the time. But the Davis, for example, Judge Davis, he said, well, that's true, but the people who got the money are the Sanlam policyholders. And then Sanlam was demutualized. So those people got it as shares. So we can't get it back from them. It's not ABSA's money. But the point is that money is still there. Those Sanlam policyholders all still exist. Just as all the property owners in all of our metropolitan areas still exist. And those property are still accumulating value. Now, it may mean that you can't go and find them, but it doesn't mean that the system that was there supported all of that protection of that, or protected that system of wealth. And so part of that market transition was a demutualization of all the insurance pension funds, etc. It was a protection of all the pensioners in Transnet and the post office, etc. That was all protected under the negotiated settlement. And let me just jump to talk about, there's a very useful chapter, I think, on agriculture, which I'm going to just make a couple of points about. And this is a criticism of the chapter. The chapter talks about the importance of agriculture and food, but doesn't go far enough, I think. It talks about it as in, we need to bring more small farmers into agricultural production. We need to go beyond corporate social responsibility. But it says liberalization was broadly deemed a success. But liberalization removed a system of supporting white farmers with silos, supporting cooperatives with processing facilities, so Bokongo, etc., Sasco. They're all essentially the same as demutualizing. And they got ownership of the silos and the facilities and the advice that was there. And now they're all essentially internationally owned. So the JSE is really owned a lot by international shareholders, so it's difficult to actually have a conversation about racial ownership if you don't say, well, actually, we've actually allowed a very large international ownership of that. And those are the people who actually own our silos and infrastructure to a very large extent. So we need, in the agricultural, in intervening in agricultural food systems, to think about what is the food system that we have. And if you're supporting smaller producers or small participants, and this is the competition point, I think, then you have to have an affirmative system of support, not one which says, let's remove the rules and let you go into battle, with no resources. At the moment, we're saying, let's kind of remove the restrictions. We swept aside apartheid. Now go and compete. Now go and produce, go and compete. I mean, you will fail. It's very clear. Absolutely have to fail. So, I mean, there'll be a few success stories, and those will be held up as like, why isn't everybody else doing this? But the barriers to entry are not barriers in terms of removing constraints. It's also barriers in terms of access to resources. And that needs to be patient and long-term. You have to actually start and fail and learn and go again. And that's the kind of patient capital that we would require from our financial system, from our development finance institutions, etc. So the kind of things that we would get through if we had prescribed assets in the financial system. And so I think the book doesn't go far enough in terms of recognizing where we came from, that conversation that you're suggesting, the what happened conversation. Also in terms of the kind of the mind shift that we need to achieve. I do think it's a conversation rather than something which is going to get imposed. And so coming back to food, let's think about what that involves. It's not about land so much, I think. Obviously land is important, it's an asset. But it's about what do you do with that land in terms of access to opportunities. And a lot talks about growing maize. Well, actually, it's much more on the higher value agricultural crops. But also the routes to market. And there it's about, we have entities which run our food system. They're called supermarkets. And so we have supermarkets which run our food system. And the question, if we're talking about the private sector, is what is our policy for supermarkets? Not nationalizing them, but what is our policy for supermarkets to open up space, open up shelf space, routes to market advice over time? What are the kind of commitments? And just to tell you, lots of other countries are doing this because the crisis of markets is a crisis around the world. So there are strategies and policies for retail in various different countries, including countries like Zambia, close to us, who are saying they want commitments from supermarkets for their right to do business. Essentially, you won't get your license to have a new supermarket or shopping mall unless you commit to a series of undertakings around building and working with your suppliers. And we actually are not even having that conversation yet at all. We had a conversation about Walmart, and Walmart is in market share terms, is a small pimple in our retail space, really. It's very, very, very small. And so I think these are the kind of conversations that we need to have. So I would like to say maybe be a bit braver. How are we going to redistribute wealth? And I mean, in a conversation recently that I had, when we raised this, I said, well, it's going to undermine business confidence. And I don't think so. I think if you have a settlement which actually has redistribution in a structured way, it will build confidence in the future of the economy in the country. Because without that, the confidence is just going to trickle away because people will not abide by the rules any longer, which is basically where I think we are right now. And I'm not sure an anti-corruption kind of focus is really answering the underlying rationale in terms of where we, of course, it's important to have this kind of emphasis, but I think it begs a lot of questions.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to take advantage of my position as chair and ask a couple of questions to each of the speakers, and then I'll open up to the floor. I'm going to ask the questions first, and then give you an opportunity to answer. Chris, what I was interested about in what you were saying, I do think that the point of what generational change, what do we mean by a generation, and also what expectations do we have of generational transformation, I think is an important question that we rarely speak about. And that the thing about having come from a system as warped as apartheid was that it was a system that was designed specifically, explicitly to achieve that kind of generational change in a single generation. And so those initial policies in that the first 10 years from 48 to about 58, 60. I mean, from 60, the focus then all becomes around securitization, right? Because you're suddenly dealing with, you have to be a repressive system because you're dealing to the backlash to what you've been doing for the previous 12 years. But from 48 to 59, 60, the entire the swathe of legislation, of policy that is coming out of the National Party is designed with the explicit intention to have the kind of rapid generational change of income and then wealth that we now are expecting, and I think there's a great deal of expectation to do that now. But what the apartheid state was able to do and what it did went against the laws of all economics, of politics, and, because of the kind of system that they created. So I think that the point of how do you manage that, because also the cause of justice, and of morality, of ethics, is that you do need to meet those demands also from Black South Africans in the 21st century, and I think in particular young Black South Africans who've been born since 1994. My second years were born in 1998. And the extent of deep frustration at how little, they say you teach them politics and you'll teach them about South African politics, and you're sort of talking about how bad things were in the 60s and the 70s, and they're like, but things are still bad. And I think there's a legitimate frustration at how little things have changed. And so, with that sort of big introduction, I'd like to hear more about what you're suggesting about the change in the social welfare system. Because together with that sense that things have changed very little, with my students, and the thing that always surprises me is that when you ask them about whether South Africa's welfare system is right, is South Africa a welfare state? And they'll all say yes. And is South Africa an extensive welfare state? And they'll say yes, and we can't afford it. And then when you tell them just how little welfare support we actually have in South Africa, they're always shocked. Because the narrative in the media, in the newspapers, we're all neoliberal in our approach to things like this, is that South Africa, there are all these people just milking the state and milking taxpayers, when actually South Africa's welfare system is very limited. And so I would like to hear some of your views on the kinds of changes that we could have to our welfare system to really focus a bit on building up a base for economic growth to take place. And then I'm very glad that Simon mentioned it, and I'm going to try and find it as quickly as I can. But this idea of the social compact and the kinds of difficult conversations that we need to have as a country. I thought that the way in which you guys talk about this idea of the difficult conversations and that whole framework about difficult conversations is an important one. For those of you who are going to look at this, it's on page 61. And basically that, as Simon had said, that there's a what happened conversation, there's a feelings conversation about recognizing the emotional charge and damage between the two parties, and then there's the identity conversation, where and I think we're definitely in that space at the moment,